talk about the processes by which we try and measure cost as an industry and the ways they could be improved with relatively small investment. So hopefully you can see my slides now. Every week, I review processes with multiple construction companies, and there are kind of common cost control problems I see in the industry. I want to talk to these problems from three perspectives. We have this dream of foresight when it comes to cost issues, and I want to talk about what forecasting could be by looking at how it's done in other industries. We all know cash flow is the killer in construction as well. ISG has already been mentioned, Carillion, the knock-on consequences this has in the supply chain because we're such a tight-knit industry. I want to talk about how this perfect storm of delay payment terms that we have and razor-thin profit margins we found ourselves in, and maybe some potential solutions that can help mitigate those issues. And lastly, I want to talk about ownership of change and how variations on projects could be improved. And we all know this should be a straightforward process, but change is often pointed to as the cause of a project or even a business's failure due to unexpected costs. So jumping straight in, foresight versus forecasting. Um, I'm going to be controversial, but I don't think we forecast in construction. I think what we do is aggregate lots of small events. So I'm thinking of like delays, expected delivery dates, expected completion of work, even those sorts of things. We do this in the form of CVRs, project programs, site reports. And what we do is we think by adding all these small predictions together, it averages out, we aggregate them, and then that gives us foresight on the project trajectory of projects and businesses. I don't think that's true forecasting. I think true forecasting comes from statistical analysis of current and up to date data. And then you do that comparison against historical trends. There's lots of different ways you can do forecasting. How often do you actually see individual projects being benchmarked against prior projects data once they've got to the ground? I've obviously seen it happen when you're in the pre-construction stage. You do checks on estimated prices, program length, but I've never seen an on-site project be compared against lots of prior completed projects data. In reality, we run businesses off these forecasts as well. But deep down, we know these forecasts aren't good enough because there's always loose contingency on projects, and risk is priced into projects from the outset, rarely against any specific site activities as well. It's always kind of a blanket number that will maybe float on cost codes or to a large variation that's been expected. And as we know, with risk in any industry, that doesn't get given for free. People will take it on, it has a cost, someone always pays for it in the long run. I just want to show you two graphs really quickly. So for the last 60 years, you can see construction's down here in the orange, and we've got some other industries on this graph. Productivity in almost every other industry has been steadily increasing, with productivity in the overall economy, which you can see here in the gray, in the 60-year period has basically tripled in that time, while construction has barely moved the needle. Despite it being a highly competitive market, where competition is normally driving productivity in these spaces, a lack of innovation means jumps in productivity just haven't happened in construction. Correlating really strongly with this is technological spending. Once again, we're looking at lots of industries, we find construction at the very bottom of the table. This combination of low productivity, and we really find ourselves being trapped in a valley where we've built a competition for a race to the bottom, means almost no technological spending, so very little innovation. This means we can't capture data, and as an industry, business cost decisions are being made based solely on reporting coming from the people delivering the work themselves. I'm sure people on the site, the people actually doing the work, the project management teams, believe these are earnest reports, but you can definitely get blinkered on the actual work and the actual impacts and the larger market situations that are taking place. And costs can easily get out of hand when there isn't a second pair of eyes coming from true statistical analysis. So that's all well and good. I can hear you saying we can't afford to spend because we can't afford to be more expensive. That's the race to the bottom that I'm talking about. I truly think there's a huge lack of digitizing processes in construction. When construction companies look for technological solutions, in my experience, it's always to answer a specific problem, often without a vision to try and tackle what we're actually in the business of, which is managing risk. People go to main contractors to manage subcontractors because they want to take the risk off their plate and have someone own that process as well. Risk is where cost and its dangers lies. Every single other industry dealing with risk does proper analysis and proper forecasting, and they succeed in the long term as a result of it. But in construction, I always see we're so focused on head down, working in the field to use an analysis that we have no eyes for the predator that's going to pounce on our backs. This is all very high level stuff. And I also want to talk about some stuff that's close to sight. So let's start talking about cash flow and costs. We know cash is king in any business, but we have unique problems in construction that really make predicting cash flow extremely difficult. When it comes to incoming cash, there are many construction specific complex systems that people have to do work on, and it makes it extremely difficult to know when that incoming cash is coming in and how much is coming in. Things like CIS, retentions, long delays between work being done and the payment terms in the contract, meaning cash comes in a lot later. Disagreements and valuations is an extremely common thing. All of those lead to an extremely murky picture of what income actually can be expected and when you expect it to be coming in. The same is true of what's going out and when. Again, we find ourselves coming up against uncertainty. And this happens at every stage in delivery and every stage as we work our way down the supply chain. Cost buffer is always introduced to add a little cushion for any misstep that might take place. All this cash that goes through the supply chain could be cash that could be otherwise used for investment and innovation if the picture were even a little bit clearer for all the parties involved. What's really frustrating with all those items that I've spoken about is that they are known and true values. So CIS is a known figure based on the trade and value of work taking place. Retentions and delayed payments, they're all in the contracts and subcontracts. And again, agreed standards aside for actual work complete, valuations should be reflective of the work that's completed. But these are often all processes that are handled manually, with the outcomes of these manual calculations taking place out of the view of the people that are actually going to be impacted by them. So QS is doing their calculations, is well away from the actual subcontractors that are going to see that work until they just get a certificate back often against their application. Something we also need to appreciate is that as you go down the supply chain, these issues multiply and add up on top of one another. They aggregate, and companies lower down what we should call the food chain inevitably shoulder more risk as they're exposed to more of these one sided transactions and decision making processes that are completely out of their hands. And even though the headlines go for the big companies collapsing, again, ISG is the most recent one, Carillion in the past, it's always the supply chain that bears the brunt of outstanding costs when work has already been delivered. Lower down in the supply chain, more jobs are lost than the original companies that go out of business. So, moving on from cash flow and costs, speaking about bearing the brunt of those issues, let's talk about ownership of change and the costs associated with it. The only constant in construction that I've seen is change. You've probably heard that term before. If anyone has ever worked on a large project where there's not been a single change, I'd love to hear that story. But when unforeseen change is inevitable, why are we not better at this process? And why are we not clear who bears these costs from the outset? In contractual terms, as Stevens mentioned, it should be simple to track, relatively simple from the outset. Everyone makes an agreement, and then the process by which change impacts parties should be well aware. NEC and JCT try to make this clear. Typically, obviously, I'm simplifying a lot, the party that caused the change should pay for the change. We, of course, all know things aren't that simple. There are always unforeseen impacts to other parties. So, changing the groundworks, for example, will mean a delay to all the remaining packages on a project at the very least. A change in spec can have implications to multiple packages at once. And typically on projects, teams find themselves having to individually trace and inform impacted parties, which just seems crazy when we have lots of technological solutions that can streamline that whole process. So, for example, for a revision in design, why don't we look at the information everyone was sent at the start? If their drawings are impacted as a result of this, let's give them notice of some sort, even though we don't know the complete solution or the complete picture. Let's just notify them the moment a change is going to impact something that's been previously agreed on. If someone's package of work is delayed, for example, let's automatically notify them that something has changed, even if we don't know exactly what yet. Technology could easily close the gap between change happening on a project and informing stakeholders as quickly as possible. So the inevitable variations don't lead to gaps in workload for subcontractors, which really is a killer for their cash flow and the costs they're trying to manage in there. If we can smooth out that curve between those stages in the supply chain, we can get rid of some of that cash buffer that I've been talking about and really try and streamline people's cash flow, which is the killer in our industry. So, in summary, I believe there are relatively easy changes that can be made in the way we track, forecast, and measure cost impacts across the industry. Digitizing processes. I don't mean just bringing in technological solutions to fix a single problem, bring them in to fix the problem and increase productivity for that particular piece of work, but also use the data that's being generated to have a second pair of eyes for forecasting, for those kinds of information, for tracking risks on projects so we can see that stuff coming down the line, make allocations for costs before they become an issue, and not scramble and try and fix stuff far too late, and then keep other parties informed of these processes as well. Clearer and more current communication in that vein as well, of cash incoming and outgoings between parties could help everyone plan their cash flow better and reduce that buffer introduced at each stage through the supply chain. Because of the complexities that we have in the construction industry, they're known values, they may seem complex, but we do calculations for much more complex things in lots of other industries. Let's just bring that knowledge and bring it into construction to help with this cost management. And with ownership of change as well, I'm not talking about reallocating who owns what risk. That's not the realm that I work in. I'm talking about simply informing those that will be affected as quickly as possible. There are technological solutions that can help with this process that are already available and easily pay for themselves very, very quickly. I really think taking these steps will make companies far more stable in our industry, give them sight of issues they wouldn't have been aware of before much earlier, and truly grasp costs in volatile times. I truly believe that the companies giving themselves that have breathing room should be investing to be able to weather issues with supply chain and cost volatility coming up. Thank you very much.